February 10, 1952. Over the frozen skies of North Korea, a single American pilot dives into a formation of 12 enemy MiG-15s. Minutes later, he becomes a legend and a mystery. His name, George Andrew Davis, Jr., America's top jet ace. He shot down more MiGs than anyone else, then vanished in enemy territory. For 72 years, no one knew exactly where he fell, until now. The discovery of his F-86 Sabre and remains has reopened one of the most enduring stories of the Korean War, a tale of heroism, controversy, and unfinished chapters in American military history. This isn't just a story about a pilot. It's a story about what nations remember and what they choose to forget. Now, to really understand what happened that cold February morning and why it mattered so much, we need to go back a bit. We need to set the stage. Picture this. It's 1952, and America is deep into the Korean War. The conflict has been raging for nearly 2 years, and the skies over North Korea have become one of the most dangerous places on Earth. There's a stretch of airspace near the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China, that American pilots have a name for. They call it MiG Alley, and believe me, that name says it all. MiG Alley was where the best Soviet-built MiG-15 fighters, flown by Chinese, North Korean, and even Soviet pilots, would come screaming across the border to intercept American bombers and fighter jets. The MiG-15 was a formidable machine, fast, nimble, and heavily armed. It could climb higher and faster than almost anything we had at the time. But we had something too. We had the F-86 Sabre, a sleek, swept-wing jet that was the pride of American engineering. And more importantly, we had pilots who knew how to fly it. Jet combat was still brand new. Think about it. Just a few years earlier, during World War II, most fighters were propeller-driven. Now, suddenly, we were in the jet age. Speeds had doubled. Tactics were still being written in real time. Every dogfight was a test, a laboratory in the sky. And in that laboratory, aces were born. An ace, if you're not familiar, is a pilot who shoots down 5 or more enemy aircraft. It's a mark of skill, courage, and a little bit of luck. And in the Korean War, aces became symbols. They were heroes to the American public, proof that even in a new kind of war, American grit and ingenuity could still win the day. But here's the thing. Being an ace also made you valuable, maybe too valuable. The Air Force knew that experienced combat pilots were worth their weight in gold. They could train the next generation, pass on their knowledge, keep our advantage alive. So there was a policy, unwritten at first but understood. Once you racked up a certain number of kills, once you became a top ace, you were supposed to rotate out, come home, train others, live to fight another day. But policies and reality don't always line up, especially in the heat of war, and that's where George Andrew Davis, Jr. comes in. To understand why his disappearance mattered so much, why it shook people all the way up to Congress, we need to know the man behind the legend. So, let me take you way back, to a small town in Texas. George Andrew Davis, Jr. was born on December 4th, 1920, in Dublin, Texas. Dublin's a quiet place, the kind of town where everybody knows everybody. George was the 7th of 9 children. 9? Can you imagine? His father, George Sr., worked hard to keep the family fed during some of the toughest years this country has ever seen, the Great Depression. The Davis family didn't have much, but they had each other, and they had values, hard work, faith, discipline. George grew up on a farm, learning early what it meant to put in a full day's work. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't loud. Friends and family later described him as quiet, thoughtful, someone who listened more than he talked. He had straight black hair, which, for reasons only the military can explain, earned him the nickname Curly. He didn't drink, he didn't smoke. In a time and a profession where both were almost expected, George stood out by standing firm in his principles. After high school, he went to Harding College in Arkansas for a little while, but college wasn't calling to him. He came back home and tried his hand at farming. But something else was stirring. The world was changing. War clouds were gathering over Europe and the Pacific, and George Davis, the quiet farm boy from Texas, felt a pull toward something bigger. In 1942, with America fully engaged in World War II, George enlisted in the Army Air Forces. He wanted to fly, and it turned out he was born to do it. Flight training was rigorous. Not everyone made it through. But George did, and he did it with the same calm determination he'd shown all his life. He earned his wings and was assigned to a fighter squadron. Before long, he was headed to the Pacific Theater, to the steaming jungles of New Guinea, where American forces were fighting tooth and nail to push back the Japanese advance. This was George's baptism by fire. He flew the P-47 Thunderbolt, a big, tough fighter bomber that could take a beating and keep flying. And George? He didn't just fly it, he mastered it. Mission after mission, he proved himself. He wasn't reckless, but he was fearless when it counted. He had a gift, an almost instinctive understanding of aerial combat. He could read the sky, anticipate an enemy's move, and strike with lethal precision. His first victory came during those early days in the Pacific, and then another and another. By the time the war in the Pacific was winding down, George Andrew Davis, Jr. was an ace. He'd shot down 7 Japanese aircraft, a remarkable achievement. But more than the numbers, it was the way he flew that people remembered. Calm under fire, disciplined, deadly. For his actions, he was awarded the Silver Star, multiple Distinguished Flying Crosses, and 9 Air Medals. His commanders noticed. His fellow pilots respected him. George Davis was no longer just a farm boy from Texas. He was a warrior. When World War II ended in 1945, millions of American servicemen came home, hung up their uniforms, and tried to return to normal life. George came home too, but normal life didn't quite fit him anymore. The skies had a hold on him, so he stayed in. He took assignments stateside, training the next generation of fighter pilots, honing his skills, and even joining an aerobatic team, one of the early precursors to what would become the famous Thunderbirds. Then, in 1947, something big happened. The United States Army Air Forces became the United States Air Force, a separate branch of the military. George Davis was right there, part of that new beginning. He was recommissioned as an officer in the Air Force, and he kept flying, kept training, kept preparing. Because even though World War II was over, the world wasn't at peace. The Cold War was heating up. The Soviet Union and the United States were locked in a tense global struggle. And in 1950, that struggle turned hot on the Korean Peninsula. When North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union and China, invaded South Korea in June of 1950, the United States and the United Nations responded. American forces were sent to hold the line, and soon the conflict became a full-scale war. And for pilots like George Davis, men who had seen combat before, men who knew what war demanded, there was no question. They were needed again. By late 1951, George was assigned to the 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing, one of the premier fighter units in Korea. They flew the F-86 Sabre, and their mission was clear: control the skies, protect our bombers, shoot down the enemy. And the enemy, more often than not, was the MiG-15. George's first MiG kill came in November of 1951. And then it happened again. And again. He was a natural, just as he'd been in World War II, but now he was even better, more experienced, more precise. His fellow pilots started calling him One Burst Davis because of his uncanny ability to destroy an enemy aircraft with a single, perfectly aimed burst of gunfire. No wasted ammunition, no second chances needed. Just one burst, and the MiG would tumble from the sky. By early 1952, George Davis wasn't just an ace. He was the top American jet ace of the entire war. He commanded the 334th Fighter Squadron, leading men into combat with the same quiet confidence he'd always shown. His leadership inspired his pilots. They trusted him. They followed him. And the enemy feared him. But there was something else. Something not many people knew at the time. George wanted to come home. He'd done his duty, more than his duty. He had a wife, Doris, waiting for him back in the States. He'd been in combat for months, racking up kill after kill, pushing his luck every single day over MiG Alley. According to the unwritten rules, he should have been rotated out. He should have been brought home to train others, to share what he knew. That's what happened to other top aces. But it didn't happen to George Davis. Some say it was bureaucracy. Some say it was because he was too valuable in the air. Others whispered that he was being kept there against his will, that the Air Force wanted the propaganda win of having their top ace still in the fight. Whatever the reason, George stayed. And on the morning of February 10, 1952, he took off on what would be his final mission. The mission was supposed to be a standard patrol, escorting American bombers near the Yalu River, right on the edge of MiG Alley. George was flying his F-86 Sabre, tail number FU 799, and his wingman that day was Lieutenant William Littlefield. The sky was cold, clear, and dangerous. It always was up there. Then, suddenly, they spotted them. 12 MiG-15s. Diving down toward a formation of American bombers. 12-2. Most pilots would have radioed for help, waited for reinforcements. But George Davis wasn't most pilots. He saw those bombers, saw American lives in danger, and he didn't hesitate. He dove. Littlefield followed, struggling to keep up as George's Sabre screamed down toward the enemy formation. The MiGs scattered, but George was already locked on. His first burst of fire struck true. A MiG exploded in a ball of flame. Before the wreckage even hit the ground, George had another one in his sights. Another burst, another kill. 2 MiGs down in seconds. But now the odds had shifted. The remaining MiGs weren't running anymore. They were turning, coming back, surrounding him. George's Sabre twisted and turned, trying to shake them, but there were too many. And then it happened. A burst of cannon fire slammed into his aircraft. Littlefield, still desperately trying to cover him, saw the hit. He saw George's F-86 shudder, saw smoke pour from the engine, saw it spiral down toward the frozen earth below. Littlefield screamed into his radio, calling for George to bail out, to pull the ejection handle, to save himself. But there was no response. No parachute blossomed in the sky. George's Sabre continued its terrible descent, disappearing into the mountains of North Korea. Lieutenant Littlefield circled as long as he dared, hoping, praying for some sign of life. But there was nothing. Just smoke rising from the crash site deep in enemy territory. With his fuel running low and MiGs still in the area, Littlefield had no choice. He turned south and headed home, his heart heavy with the knowledge that America's top jet ace was gone. George Andrew Davis, Jr. was declared missing in action, presumed killed. He was 31 years old. He'd shot down 14 enemy aircraft, more than any other American jet pilot in the Korean War. And now he was gone, vanished somewhere in the frozen mountains of North Korea, a place no American could reach. Back home, the news hit hard. George's wife, Doris, was devastated. The American public mourned. But then, as the shock began to fade, questions started to surface. Hard questions, uncomfortable questions. Why was George Andrew Davis still flying combat missions? Why hadn't he been rotated home like other aces? Who made that decision? Doris Davis spoke publicly about her husband's situation. She said he'd wanted to come home. He'd written to her about it. He'd done his duty, more than his duty. But somehow, he'd been kept there. She didn't understand why, and frankly, neither did a lot of other people. The whispers grew louder. Newspaper editorials asked pointed questions, and finally, Congress took notice. An investigation was launched. Congressmen demanded answers from the Air Force. Why was America's top jet ace, a national hero, a man whose face had been in newspapers across the country, still flying daily combat missions over the most dangerous airspace in the war? The Air Force had policies, or at least understandings about rotating out high-value pilots. So why was George Davis still there? The answers, when they came, were complicated and unsatisfying. Some officials claimed there had been plans to rotate him out, but the paperwork hadn't gone through yet. Others said that Davis himself had volunteered to stay, that he felt a duty to his squadron. Still others pointed to the desperate need for experienced leadership in the air, the constant pressure of MiG Alley, the reality that sometimes policies get bent when lives are on the line. But none of that satisfied Doris Davis. None of it satisfied the American public. And it certainly didn't satisfy the men who'd flown with George, who knew that he'd been ready to come home, who'd seen the exhaustion in his eyes even as he kept climbing into that cockpit day after day. The truth, as it often is in war, was probably somewhere in the middle. A combination of bureaucratic delays, operational necessity, and perhaps a reluctance by commanders to lose their best pilot right when they needed him most. But whatever the truth was, it didn't change the outcome. George Andrew Davis, Jr. was gone, and someone had to be held accountable for keeping him in harm's way longer than he should have been. The controversy didn't end there, though, because once the immediate shock and grief began to fade, another question emerged, a question that military historians and aviation enthusiasts would debate for decades. Who actually shot him down? Who pulled the trigger that killed America's top jet ace? In the immediate aftermath, as reports filtered back from the battlefield, credit for shooting down Davis was given to a Chinese pilot named Zhang Jihui. Zhang was flying with the People's Liberation Army Air Force, and according to Chinese records, he claimed the kill. For years, that was the accepted story. Zhang Jihui, a skilled and aggressive pilot, had bested George Davis in aerial combat. It was a propaganda victory for China, proof that their pilots could stand toe-to-toe with America's best. But as the years passed, and as the Cold War eventually thawed enough for some secrets to start leaking out, a different story began to emerge. Soviet archives, carefully guarded for decades, started to become accessible to researchers, and what they found was surprising. It turned out that Soviet pilots, not just Chinese or North Korean pilots, had been flying combat missions over Korea. This wasn't widely known at the time, at least not officially, because the Soviet Union didn't want to be seen as directly engaging American forces. That could have escalated the war into something much worse. So Soviet pilots flew in secret, often at night, wearing Chinese or North Korean uniforms, under strict orders not to speak Russian over the radio. And according to Soviet records, one of those pilots, a man named Mikhail Averin, claimed that he shot down an American F-86 on February 10, 1952, the same day George Davis died. Averin was an experienced pilot, and his after-action report matched the details of Davis's final flight. So now there were two claims, two pilots from two different countries, both saying they'd shot down the same American ace. Who was right? Historians still debate it. Maybe it was Zhang. Maybe it was Avrin. Maybe, in the chaos of that dogfight with 12 MiGs and tracer fire crisscrossing the sky, both of them hit Davis's plane and neither one knew the other was there. We may never know for certain. But here's what we do know. Shortly after the crash, Chinese search teams found the wreckage. They found George Davis's F-86 Sabre, crumpled and broken in the mountains. And they found something else. They found his dog tags, those small metal rectangles stamped with his name, his service number, his blood type. Proof that they'd found America's top ace. But his remains were never returned. Not during the war, not during the armistice negotiations, not during the decades of the Cold War that followed. George Andrew Davis, Jr. had vanished into enemy territory, and there he stayed. His family held a funeral, but the casket was empty. His name was added to the rolls of those missing in action, one of thousands of American servicemen whose final resting place was unknown. The years turned into decades. The Korean War, often called the Forgotten War, faded from public consciousness. Veterans grew older. Widows, like Doris Davis, carried their grief quietly. And George's story, though remembered by aviation historians and those who'd served with him, became just one more tale from a distant conflict. But some stories refused to stay buried. For 72 years, the question lingered. Where exactly was George Davis? Where did he fall? And could he ever be brought home? Then, in recent years, something remarkable happened. Joint recovery missions, efforts involving the United States, North Korea, and international organizations began working to locate and recover the remains of servicemen still missing from the Korean War. These missions are painstaking, difficult work. The terrain is harsh. Records are incomplete. Crash sites have been reclaimed by nature, buried under decades of growth and erosion. But the teams kept searching. They used old military records, eyewitness accounts, aerial photographs, ground-penetrating radar, anything that might lead them to a missing serviceman. And eventually, they found it. They found the crash site of F-86 Sabre tail number FU-799. The site was remote, high in the mountains, just as Lieutenant Littlefield had reported all those years ago. The wreckage was scattered, pieces of aluminum and steel slowly being reclaimed by the earth. But it was there, and more importantly, they found human remains. The remains were carefully excavated, treated with the dignity and reverence they deserved, and transported back to the United States. Then came the painstaking work of identification. Forensic anthropologists examined the bones. DNA samples were compared against family members. Dental records were reviewed, and finally the confirmation came. After 72 years, George Andrew Davis, Jr. was coming home. The news sent ripples through the veteran community, through military history circles, through the families of all those still missing from the Korean War. It was a moment of closure, but also a moment of profound sadness. 72 years. An entire lifetime had passed. Doris Davis, his wife, had passed away in 1995, never knowing that her husband would one day be found. His children had grown old waiting, but he was found. And that matters. It matters because it says that we don't forget, that no matter how much time passes, we keep looking, we keep our promises to those who served. George Andrew Davis, Jr. was laid to rest with full military honors. His F-86 Sabre, or what remains of it, stands as a testament in museums, a piece of history that visitors can see and touch. And his story, once a mystery, is now complete. But beyond the facts, beyond the debris and the forensic reports and the dog tags, there's something else. There's a legacy. George Andrew Davis, Jr. was more than just numbers on a scorecard. Yes, he shot down 14 enemy aircraft, making him the top American jet ace of the Korean War. Yes, he earned the Medal of Honor, awarded posthumously in 1953 for his final act of valor, diving alone into 12 enemy fighters to protect American bombers. Yes, he was the only American jet ace killed in action during the Korean War, and yes, he was the fourth highest scoring ace of the entire conflict. But if you talk to the men who flew with him, if you read the letters he wrote home, if you listen to the stories passed down through his family, you realize that what made George Davis special wasn't just his skill. It was his character. He was a farm boy who never forgot where he came from. He was a leader who earned respect not through bluster or bravado, but through quiet competence and genuine care for his men. He was a husband who wanted nothing more than to come home to his wife. He was a man of principle who didn't drink, didn't smoke, didn't compromise his values even when everyone around him did. And when the moment came, when he saw American lives in danger, he didn't hesitate. He didn't calculate the odds. He didn't think about his own survival or his ticket home or his place in history. He dove, because that's what heroes do. His name lives on. Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona is named partly in his honor. Aviation museums display his medals, his photographs, the story of his life. Books have been written, documentaries have been made, and now, with the recovery of his remains, a new generation is learning about the quiet kid from Texas who became America's top jet ace. But perhaps his greatest legacy is this. He reminds us that behind every statistic, every medal, every name on a memorial wall, there's a person, a son, a husband, a friend, someone who loved and was loved. Someone who made a choice to serve, knowing full well what it might cost. The recovery of George Davis's remains after 72 years is more than just closing a case file. It's a statement. It's a promise kept. It's a reminder that time does not erase honor, that duty extends beyond death, and that a grateful nation does not forget its heroes no matter how long they've been gone. There are still thousands of American servicemen missing from the Korean War, thousands more from World War II, from Vietnam, from conflicts all over the world. Each one of them has a story. Each one of them has a family waiting, hoping, praying for the day they might finally come home. George Davis's recovery gives those families hope. It shows that the mission continues, that we're still looking, that we'll never stop looking. And for those of us who didn't serve, who didn't put on the uniform, who didn't face down 12 enemy fighters over frozen mountains, George's story asks something of us too. It asks us to remember, not just on Veterans Day or Memorial Day, but every day. It asks us to tell these stories, to pass them down, to make sure that the sacrifices made in distant skies and foreign lands are never forgotten. Because here's the thing, George Andrew Davis, Jr. didn't vanish. Not really. He's been here all along, in the memories of those who knew him, in the lessons he taught, in the example he set. And now, finally, his remains have come home. But his spirit, his legacy, his story, those have been home all along, living in the hearts of everyone who believes that courage, duty, and sacrifice still matter. This isn't just a story about a pilot. It's a story about who we are as a nation, about what we value, about what we're willing to fight for and what we refuse to forget. It's a story that spans 72 years, from a frozen sky over North Korea to a recovery team's careful excavation, from a young farm boy's decision to serve to an old veteran's tears when he learned that his commander was finally coming home. So, if stories like this move you, if you believe heroes deserve to be remembered long after the last shot is fired, then help keep their legacy alive. Like this video. Subscribe for more untold war stories. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Were you, or someone you know, part of the Korean War era? Your stories matter too, your memories matter, your service matters. Together we remember. Together we honor. Together we make sure that men like George Andrew Davis Jr. are never truly lost, because we carry them with us, in our hearts and in our history forever. George Andrew Davis Jr., America's top jet ace, born December 1, 1920, killed in action February 10, 1952, returned home 72 years later, a hero, a husband, a leader, a legend, and finally, at long last, at rest. We remember.